Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Posturite Lunchtime webinar. My name is John Ridd, and I'm taking the anchor role for today's talk. Today's one is entitled Fire Risk Assessment, and is going to be presented by Nick Carstens. Nick is a health and safety consultant with the Work-Right Consultancy Division of Posturite. And before we start, though, there are just a couple of housekeeping points that I need to mention, and forgive me if you've heard these before. But there should be on your screen, on the right-hand side of your screen, a panel. Now, if you are having any problems, technical problems with the transmission, then please do put your questions in the box below to our technical people, and we'll try and help you out. But also, that same box can be used for putting any questions that you may have about Nick's presentation, about any questions that arise during it that you would like to have considered, and we'll try and get back to those at the end of Nick's presentation. And on that note, I think, rather than taking any more time, I'll hand straight over to Nick for this talk on fire risk assessment. So, Nick, over to you, please.
Lovely, thank you, John. Okay, well, welcome everyone to a short talk on fire safety. This is what we're going to aim to cover in the next sort of 20 minutes, half an hour. A little bit about fire safety law, some of the responsibilities and duties that we have as employers or health and safety managers or responsible persons. A little about induction and training. I'm going to take a look at fire risk assessments. I get a lot of questions around fire risk assessments usually, so I hope to cover that in a little bit of detail. Again, some of the key points, key actions that you need to be doing, and just to sort of cap it off with a look at a couple of recent fire safety cases, some large fires that have resulted in some hefty fines, kind of exploring what went wrong and the learning points from it. Okay, so what we've seen recently, I say recently, about 2005, was the consolidation of about 70 different fire safety regulations into one single fire safety order. Very general, a point the fire safety order makes is basically not just consolidation, but to simplify the process of fire safety for employers. That was the idea, to make it all very simple, one piece of regulation that kind of governs everything. Just requiring sort of employers, responsible persons to take general fire precautions to ensure, so far as is reasonably practical, the safety of his employees and non-employees. It raises two immediate points there, sort of who is this responsible person and what is reasonable. Now, those of you that work in the health and safety profession, I'm sure, will be very familiar with the two terms. But when it comes to fire safety, it's amazing the kind of debates you can get around who's responsible and what is reasonable. I'm going to touch on those very shortly. So, the responsible person, usually a hot potato in any workplace, so it's not to say that any one of us at any one point can say, oh, I'm the responsible person and take all fire safety responsibility. Generally speaking, they look at the amount of control influence anyone has, usually sort of directors, chief executives. Not to say that certain elements of fire safety can't be sort of delegated down to individual competent persons on site. Gets quite difficult, actually, for a lot of you might find if you're tenants in a sort of a multi-occupied building where you have a landlord. It might be that there's more than one for the site. You might have individual companies having their own fire safety leads and then a landlord in total control of the building. Reasonable practically. Now this, again, gets a lot of questions around this when we go on site. There still seems to be a lot of misunderstanding around what people need to do with regards to fire safety. I mentioned earlier the whole purpose of the fire safety order was to simplify and get away from this very prescriptive type of fire safety regulation we've seen in the past. However, it's caused these problems with many employers not knowing exactly how far they should be going. So as a general rule, we kind of think, well, you got your risk on one side, looking at time, effort, money on the other, and just trying to balance it up. Very difficult to do, especially with fire safety, because there's usually lots of things going on and around the building that need to be considered. So come back to the key duties then the fire safety order places on employers. So to take suitable and sufficient assessment of the risk, to keep it under review, to implement your fire safety arrangements. You need to do fire drills every year. Again, I've been to a few places where this has not been done, quite concerning, or doing it at a time where there's not many people on site. I remember a few years back we went to one who was doing it sort of 8:30 in the morning, but most staff didn't arrive till 9, so you think, well, actually the purpose of the fire drill is to let people enact their fire exit. A lot of companies now getting in the habit of not blocking fire exit routes, but having a fire marshal sort of redirect people from using certain escape routes to make people think about their alternatives. Quite alarming how many people stand there, scratch their head, and actually don't know where else they should be going. Again, making sure the premises, again, what is appropriately to equip with firefighting detectors, alarms, etc. Again, these aren't retrospective. Certainly building regs now have certain requirements for detection systems. A lot of this will be as a result of your risk assessment to decide what's appropriate for your site. Making sure equipment that you do provide is easily accessible, simple to use, indicated by signs. That doesn't mean sort of hiding fire extinguishers around corners and things like that. You see that a lot, unfortunately. And again, taking measures to adapt firefighting to the premises, nominating competent persons to implement those measures. I'm going to come back to that very shortly. Ensuring emergency exits are kept clear. Again, it's an unfortunate reality. A lot of places we do go around, we still see emergency exit routes sort of not totally blocked. Fortunately, that's becoming less common, but sort of bags, cables, things sort of laying in front of emergency exit routes. It's picking up on that point actually further. What I'm also seeing a lot of, I'm sure some of you are, if you're going around to multiple premises, it's sort of a lack of very basic safety checks on properties too, and recording those. So actually being able to demonstrate that you're going around a building, checking to make sure exit routes are clear, slip, trips, falls, hazards have been considered, etc. Again, there is a requirement if you've got equipment that you provide, it could be anything, even extinguishers, automated detection, you must maintain it. Again, follow your manufacturer's guidance on that. Underline the last point because it's quite important. You know, the responsible person must appoint one or more competent persons to assess in undertaking these provisions. Now, the responsible person themselves does not have to physically know much about fire safety. They need to know that they're accountable for the fire safety, but they can sort of delegate or nominate an individual to kind of take on the more technical aspects. Usually what we see a lot is companies outsourcing fire risk assessment, fire safety advice to external consultants, or equally training up individuals within organizations to take on that role. Provided that person's got the right skills, training and competencies, that's absolutely fine. Information as well must be provided. You know, the risks identified within the risk assessment, those protective measures, and the fire safety emergency procedures too. Again, this is all within the regulatory reform fire safety order. And again, training, unfortunately one again that's missed quite a lot, especially for staff that have been in the company for a while. We seem to kind of almost assume that they should know what they're up to, and new starters get a full fire safety induction. And all I would say is do consider those people that have been in the organisation sort of 5 years or more, where actually the likelihood is they've not experienced the fire on the site, they've not been forced to consider the alternative routes, etc. Might be worth refreshing them in basic fire safety awareness. And again, if you change the building layout, the way you use the buildings, you've introduced new activities, new processes, make sure that this is considered in the training, and again, consider training for your wider staff group. Coming back to sort of information and training generally, now, obviously, information sharing is vital, not just for fire safety, but all elements of health and safety. So there's lots of options available to companies to communicate that. We see a lot of business continuity groups, increasingly including fire safety as a major part of their review. Dedicated health and safety steering groups, again, consists of reviewing fire safety arrangements. at a very basic level, team meetings are an excellent way to communicate fire safety arrangements. Managers have a really important part to play in getting people on board with fire safety arrangements. Departmental meetings as well. Moving outside of physical team meets, you've got things like posters, emails, intranet, web services now. There's so many platforms for getting information out to staff, and it doesn't just mean sort of taking a copy of the risk assessment and firing it off to all and sundry. I mean, what you could do is take out the key points of the fire risk assessments, mainly your emergency procedures, make sure staff know and understand what it is they need to do, consider language barriers, using sort of graphical representations of exit routes as well. Very more prevalent on construction sites, but equally so emerging in offices too. Now, employees do have their part to play too in all of this. Now, this is not just contained within the Fire Safety Order, but I'm sure many of you are aware the Health and Safety at Work Act, Section 7.8 has a lot not a lot of duties, but certainly places a fairly onerous duty on employees to take care of themselves, follow safety guidance and training, and not to interfere or tamper with anything. Really important in fire safety terms, because obviously removing fire extinguisher, disabling fire safety controls such as blocking over fire detectors place other employees at risk, but actually the responsible person, the chief executive as well, can be held accountable for those actions. So making sure staff know that they're not to interfere, or having a procedure to monitor that is really important. Again, it comes back to this sort of safety checks going around, making sure everything's working and people know what they should be doing, how they should be doing it. I cannot list the number of times we've done fire risk assessments and found doors propped open with fire extinguishers. I think it's known as the British Standard Door Wedge for a reason. But again, if it's not on its stand, when it do come to need it, the first place you look is naturally where it should be on the stand, and it's not there. So again, we've seen some improvement notices from the fire departments around that. Okay, so we kind of covered this, a very sort of quick tour of the fire safety order, general requirements on employers. So what we're going to do now is just take a quick look at fire risk assessments. So fire risk assessment is pretty much no different from any standard risk assessment you might do. We tend to follow the standard the 5 steps by adding some more technical element to it, but generally it follows the same format: identifying hazards, deciding who might be harmed, etc. Now, with fire safety, what you tend to find is people will split it into two kind of vague categories: the people and the place. People essentially bring the risks to the properties. Buildings very rarely self-combust. It's usually because of an activity or process that's going on within it, or a lack of maintenance that causes fire, even arson, etc. Unfortunately, a growing trend in some parts of the UK, we're seeing arson on the increase. When it comes to the place, some of the common issues we tend to find, electrical testing springs to mind. A number of occasions I've been round to find no fixed electrical testing being carried out. Plenty on the PAT side. Usually it's very widely communicated to most companies. There's lots of companies out there doing PAT testing, very competitively priced, but the fixed electrical system usually gets overlooked in the process. So making sure that that's tested on a 5-yearly or greater cycle. Most electricians defer to the 5 years because it's the safest and follows the technical guidance issued by the NIC-EIC. Again, looking at fire loading within buildings too. Now, there is a pretty big case, a fire case that happened not so long back, where fire loading was particularly listed on the improvement notice, which I'll touch on shortly. Again, security, we're seeing a lot of companies sort of increasing security arrangements on site. This is to tackle the arson, so CCTV, and really communicating with the local police and emergency services. They're there to support you. I would advise anyone who's concerned about arson risk to talk to their local police office. It's amazing how much support and assistance they can give you. And looking at the people side, it's not just people themselves. It's understanding what your staff do, how they do it, the processes that they're using on site, the equipment that they're using. There's lots of industrial guidance out there if you're using chemical processes, etc. You can tap into that, or any good fire risk assessment will be able to point you in the right direction. So some of the key points to pick up on your fire risk assessment. Now, they come in all different shapes and sizes, some very complex, lots of measurements, some very basic. Now, what is suitable for the site really depends on what you're doing and how you're doing it. Some can be as short as a few pages, some are hundreds. Obviously, you can imagine a small office block compared to a nuclear operations site, massively different. So long as it covers all of the site, and again, this is a major one to look out for, and I would advise following this, you will go and check the caveats on your fire risk assessment. We've seen ones before in the past where, yep, here's your fire risk assessment, couldn't get in the basement, couldn't get in the boiler room, and couldn't get in the loft. A bit of a problem there in that those are probably some of the highest risk areas in the building, so there's no way we could say that's a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment. So we have to make sure we cover those off before we can kind of rest on our laurels. Make sure the person who's completing fire risk assessments is competent. Ask, have you done this before, what are your qualifications, etc. Again, that all depends on the risk associated with your site. Make sure your actions, you can understand those actions in the fire risk assessment. They've got to be clear, say smart, specific, measurable, achievable, and with a realistic time frame. No general, vague, it might be this, or you could look at this. Ask for clarity with your actions. And again, consider technical guidance and best practice. Now, with technical guidance, varies so much. Now, you've got various different types of business operation going on. You've got flats, you've got offshore platforms, you've got residential care facilities, and this is kind of picking up some of the key issues. I did a lot of work with housing associations, and one of the big issues they had was scooters stored in communal areas. Now, when the batteries go, lots of nasty gases, etc., going off. So not so much of an issue for your office block, but obviously, an issue for them. So what we have to support the very general guidance issued in the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order is a suite of technical guidance, but they're kind of like approved documents that support it. Now, that's the link to where you can find it on the gov.uk site. Now, there's pretty much a guide for most kind of business operations in the UK. You've got sort of outdoor venues, offices, rail, retail, etc. They're all pretty much listed there. It's a good place to go and have a look and have a read through the guide. Certainly if you are planning to review your fire risk assessment and want a little bit of practical guidance on how your office or shop or centre can comply. Again, you have approved document B, that's building regulations, approved document B. That again is not retrospective, but if you are planning on doing something to your building in the way of physical alteration, it's likely that that document will apply and that you'll need to kind of meet the requirements set out within it. So, make sure you can identify your responsible person on site. That's not the competent person, mind. This is just the person that takes accountability for fire safety. Make sure you complete a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment so it covers the whole building. There's no issues. You've got your good actions there. Read and understand it. And have an emergency plan ready and communicated. It's often too late in an emergency to start looking at the plan, so make sure you know it beforehand. Make sure you induct staff, provide training. Make sure if you've got equipment, please maintain it. And really, this is a really key one. Manage those remedial works. It's really easy to do, I've seen them before, several hundred fire risk assessments for a large company, all different sites, and kind of pulling together all the work that's needed for those various sites and actually making sense of it. So, what needs to be done by when, how much is it going to cost, when are we going to plan it for. It's really easy for things to drop off that. So just make sure it's really well managed and communicate those arrangements with your fire safety and your fire service and the landlord. Most will find their landlords need a copy of the fire risk assessment as part of the tenancy agreement. That's normal. If it's not in the tenancy, I would advise sharing it anyway, and actually asking for a copy of your landlord's fire risk assessment too is an excellent starting point when you're completing your own, and most fire risk assessors will request it anyway. And do the drills and record them a lot of times you find with fire safety that improvement notices are issued because of the failure to record what you're doing rather than actually not doing them. So it's okay saying, yeah, we do fire drills twice a year, but actually demonstrating it is another issue. And of course, if you don't, several options available to the not just the fire service, but the HSE as well can prosecute. So you've got probation, restriction notices. Obviously quite serious, don't use the site. Huge business impacts, obviously, if you're looking at your business continuity arrangements. Alteration notices, as it kind of sounds, it's more to the physical alterations to site, could be reinstating fire doors or blocking off windows, etc., if they're too near an external stairwell. And I think one of the interesting things is that there is a register where all these notices and enforcement notices are kept, and they're kept there for, I think, 5 years. And unless you've closed the action off, I think it's 6 months following the closing of the action. So if you do get any kind of notice, it goes on a public register for everyone to have a look at. If you are doing a fire risk assessment, or you're new in post, or you don't know much about the buildings that you look after, have a look on the register. You might, well, you never know. You might see something there to give you some guidance. So it might be a useful starting point to see where there may be historic failures, to make sure that they're not repeated, or they're kept high on the agenda to make sure they're not repeated. Okay, so now what I want to do is just take a look at a couple of past fire incidents, just to kind of pull this all into context. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that picture. That's Lecknell House. That was not that long back, actually, and that's caused major ripples in the social housing sector for the way communal areas are managed and the way tenants are given fire safety information. Now, there is technical guidance out there for purpose-built flats, but actually doing it is another issue altogether. And obviously, great time, resource, and attention is needed where you've got large buildings with so many people living in them. I'm not too sure if anyone listening is sort of responsible for flats or dwellings, but I know certainly there's been a lot of lessons learned from Lecknell House around sharing information with tenants and the type of fire risk assessments conducted. Now, Newlook was an interesting one. Again, that recorded quite a high fine, AC, £400,000. Now, there were no deaths associated with this. It was really a lack of suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment. Now, of course, emergency services will always argue if your risk assessment isn't suitable or sufficient, you essentially have no fire risk assessment. So what happened here, we had a blaze that started, they believe, in the second floor, although the actual cause of the blaze, I think, was never officially recorded. Fire spread, and actually it was a neighbouring property on the opposite side of the road that had to ring it in to the emergency services. A bit of a panic in the building, people escaped, and what they found was actually, although there was no deaths, and which was really fortunate, it was failure to manage fire risk, which created for such a high fine. Now that went to appeal. The appeal was overturned on the basis that the prosecutors that actually no, £400,000 is a pretty fair reflection for the level of risk that was presented. Again, no fire risk assessment for that one. PHS, that was, again, this was the a fire that resulted as a result of, I think it was a chemical reaction there. I can give you the name of the chemical. It was a kind of additive that went into a system. It was a risk of an aerosol being added to the shredders was rated as very unlikely, and the consequence of it happening moderate. But it did happen, and it was obviously severe. So again, this was inadequate fire risk assessment associated with that. And again, quite a high form. You notice here the prosecution was Section 2 of the Health and Safety at Work Act, which was failure to protect the health, safety and welfare of employees. And Shell, again, this was quite a hefty fine as well, as £300,000, and again that the risk assessment again was just found inadequate. Now, this is a bit of a historic one with Shell. There's stuff going back some time, and the issues that were raised with Shell particularly were around the review of fire risk assessment, which it's one thing sort of knowing there is an issue, but if you know there's an issue and you don't sort of actively do something about it, and you don't do something about it for I think it was about 3 years, then obviously the chances of being prosecuted would be slightly higher. Now, I also have one from Asda. Now again, this is quite a serious one, and we had combustible items obstructing fire exit doors. We had fire exit doors wedged open as well as other failings. So again, that was a prosecution brought under the fire safety order. Risk assessments of actually managing the site. And it actually comes back to something I said earlier on about sort of getting actively involved in managing the site, walking around the site and actually spotting those issues and dealing with them. And maybe that one would have been avoided if that were happening. So in summary, I'm sure you're all going to rush out and go check all the fire risk assessments that you had. Do they make sense? When were they last completed? Are you managing those actions? I would advise talk to staff. Ask people that work in your organisation, do you know what to do in a fire? Where would you go? What are the arrangements? Don't be complacent. Unfortunately, you do see a lot of companies get prosecuted. You do see this culture of complacency, and it'll never happen to us. Keep it alive. Keep it under review. The fire risk assessment's only as good as the last review, so make sure it's kept ideally quite high up in the organisation. It should be owned really by a lead director or someone, and don't just talk about it. Actually get out there and do it really. Fire safety is one of those things that's really important to everyone. I think most people engage with it quite well. They understand it's a very tangible thing. There is a fire, there is an immediate loss, unlike when, for example, you're trying to talk to people about asbestos because of the time lag between the issues emerging. It's very difficult to comprehend, but fire safety has a huge impact on everyone. And that's it. Well, thank you very much. And John, if you're there.
I am indeed, Nick. Thank you very much for that. You did right. I'm not sure I'll go rushing out and check my fire risk assessments just yet. I need to think about more than a lot of what you've been saying, and certainly we've had quite a lot of questions. And forgive me, I've been trying to sift some of them, so I may have missed aspects if you've already covered these, what you were talking about.
That's quite all right. We can revisit any.
Okay, well, let's have a look. There's one we've had which asks about the legalities in terms of fire bell testing. What are the obligations to do this in terms of hours or frequency?
Okay, if it's fire bell testing, possibly two different things going on here. Fire bell testing is usually weekly if it's a call point test. Usually they do those weekly on a rotational basis. So if you've got 20 call points, you do one a week. Provided you get them all done within the year, that should be fine. If you've got 104, you might do 2 different ones a week. And that's really to make sure, obviously, the call points work. So if someone's going past, they press them, they go. If you haven't got call points, usually what you do is refer to your manufacturer's guidance. They might have a schedule set up for testing and maintenance. If it's to do with fire drills, the legal requirement is 1 a year. What we're seeing increasingly, though, is most companies doing 2. So sort of 1, in each kind of extreme of the season. I hope that helps. But if it's call points, it's weekly. Otherwise, manufacturers, if fire drills, legally 1 a year.
Okay, thank you for that. Another one then here. Although I should say we are running out of time to some extent, but don't worry, I will try another couple. But those questions that we don't get answered now in this session, I think what we'll try and do, Nick, if you don't mind, is if you can perhaps respond to the individuals by email a bit later.
No problem at all. No problem at all.
Well, let's just quickly try a couple more. I've been told by several fire inspectors that propping open the final fire exit door is okay. It's the internal fire doors that are the problem. Do you have a comment?
I mean, personally, I would argue any fire door should be kept shut. I mean, the building regulations certainly specify all the final exit doors are fire rated. If they're fire rated, they're probably for a reason. So I would say if it's a fire door, keep it shut. If it's going to be propped open, certainly my advice would be use something like a door guard, which is a door opening device that can be actuated by the sound, so it'll shut it in the event of a fire. Really sort of the blowback and the fact that your fire is going to be fed from an oxygen supply coming in from the outside and continually will be until someone shuts the door suggests that someone's going to have to go quite near to shut it if it's not already closed. So generally, if it's designed as a fire door, keep it shut.
Okay, sounds highly sensible. Yes, one that's I think just come in, which others may be thinking about. They've said you mentioned that you would be touching on the fire loading of a building. Now, can you perhaps expand on that?
That was actually the Asda case. Was around fire loading, and then what happened is they were storing a large amount of combustible material in fire exit routes. So the fire loading is essentially the quantity of stuff that's likely to burn inside the building. So obviously where you position it is very important. So generally what you see in most complexes is a segregated fire exit route that's protected from the store area, rather than combustibles being stored along a fire exit route or in an area that's likely to cause, you know, an impact on the building or the ability for people to escape. Generally speaking, offices I've not seen so many issues with offices. It's more around sort of warehousing, logistics centres, places like that where they have stuff to store. The issue is usually, okay, where do you put it? Schools particularly, actually, you see a lot of schools with problems around fire loading, the volume of stationary equipment they bring in, and actually where to store it and how to store it. Very important. But again, in your risk assessment, you'll cover off, okay, how much stuff can we sort of stick up along the walls? You'll see it a lot, paper and cardboard, artwork all up on the sides of the walls right to the very top, and generally sometimes even across the ceiling. You can imagine at a fire that's going to rapidly spread down the hallway and quickly put out that fire exit route. So that's kind of when we talk about fire loading, we're really talking about the ability for stuff to burn and where it's positioned.
Right, yeah. Okay, I'm getting concerned now. We've got stacks of questions here, which I think we're, my apologies to the audience, but I think we're going to have to respond to most of these by email. But if I can just give you, Nick, one final one, which is quite I think a definite, clear one. They've asked, if a corridor provides a minimum of 30 minutes fire protection and it is subdivided by fire doors, can each of those compartments be considered as a place of reasonable safety?
Wow, that's a very technical one, and obviously it really does depend on what's around the corridors and where they lead. Yeah. I mean, obviously a place of ultimate safety would be far enough away from the building to watch it burn down. Generally inside the building, you know, you get refuge areas, which you can have if you have a disabled staff and you have no facility to quickly get them out. Now, obviously there's a lot of issues around that as well, and a lot of people don't like the idea of leaving anyone in the building, and actually we should be kind of get out as quickly as we can. I would say the best, I think that question being quite technical, I would say probably best to review is part of the fire risk assessment review, really. Corridors generally wouldn't say to hang around in them too long anyway.
Absolutely. It's going to be specific to the environment, isn't it, as well?
So, and I think this is the issue that a lot of people have, is that what works in one building doesn't work in another, although they might be very similar and they might do very similar things, maybe due to the building archetype or the vulnerabilities of the people within the building. Fire control varies so much.
Okay, Nick. Well, thank you very much for that. One of the other questions, if I can quickly deal with that myself, is that somebody's been asking if the slides are going to be available to everybody. Well, I can say, although forgive me, I'm not entirely sure how we do this, but the presentation will be available as a download or viewable on the
yes, John, I've
Posturite
just been told they will be, within about half an hour they'll be on the website.
My goodness, that's it. Okay, excellent. So for those of you that want to perhaps haven't had time to attend the whole thing today, then you can have a look at it later on.
Fantastic. So the web address is posturite.co.uk/webinars.
Excellent. Can you just repeat that again? If people have picked up their pens now, please.
It's posturite.co.uk/webinars.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that.
Right.
Well, and if I can just finish off by thanking you once again, Nick, for that presentation. It's clearly something that's very important to many people. We've had an enormous, a lot of people attending today, and thank you to all of those who have come along and listened to this and to have stayed with us. This, I should say, is our final Friday webinar for this year. We didn't think it very wise to try and compete with lunchtime shopping opportunity right before Christmas in December. So our next webinar will be on January the 17th next year, and that topic will be AEDs, automated external defibrillators. And we will be having, I think, a full year next year again of these webinars, which do appear to be quite popular. If anybody's got any ideas for topics they would like discussed, then we're happy to consider those. So I hope you found today's fire safety presentation useful. I'm sure from the evidence, the questions you have, the interest is certainly there. And if you would like an attendance certificate, then we can provide these, so please come back to us, email us for one of those, and we'll certainly send those out to you. And finally then, thank you very much for your attendance, and please everybody have a good afternoon. So goodbye from us.
Lovely, thank you, John.